I'll be reading Psalm 139, 7 through 12. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you.
Good morning. I should know better than to try to make any announcements if I have more than one without writing them down, because I can't remember more than one thing, although I did remember two this morning, but I forgot the third. We have a men's retreat coming up that we haven't said a whole lot about, but we do have one coming up 2 weekends from now. The Friday night, I believe, is the 29th, and Saturday is the 30th, and we need to have a quick meeting with men who are able and interested in being able to go to that retreat, just right down here down front this morning. It won't take very long. I know there's family things going on with being a holiday, and we'll make it quick, but we just need to get a quick count and kind of give out a few details. So just a few minutes after services, if you can please join us for that, that would be helpful. I know we have some visitors here today, being a holiday and travelers and things, so it's good for us to kind of recap and kind of let you know what we've been doing so that you understand kind of why we're addressing the topic that we're addressing today. We've been studying our way through the Bible this year, looking at things pertaining to the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of God, and so on the first Sunday of each month, we talk about the kingdom itself. On the second Sunday of the month, we talk about something pertaining to us as kingdom dwellers. What does that mean for us to be a part of the kingdom? And then on the third Sunday of the month, which is today, we have been working our way through a book called What Comes Next by a man named Park Linscomb. And it's talking about the afterlife, things that this life is preparing us for and what will be kind of the next manifestation of the kingdom. The kingdom that Christ has established for us to be a part of, and this life is a kingdom that continues into the next life. And so how do we prepare for that? How do we address those issues that pertain to both the kingdom now and the kingdom in its future manifestation? So that's what we'll be talking about today. And then on the fourth Sunday of the month, we talk about spreading the kingdom or growing the kingdom and how we can see the kingdom of Christ grow. So today, we're in chapter 4 of that book by Park Linscomb, What Comes Next, and we have covered things already pertaining to the world of the living, which is, of course, where we are right now. If you're here hearing my voice, listening to me right now, then you are part of the world of the living. And what does that mean? Well, it means we are created in the image of God. It means that we have a purpose, that we have a destiny, that we have something that we are working towards and preparing for as it pertains to the next life. And then last month, we looked at the topic of death, and death being the end of this life, this manifestation of our existence, and the entry point into the next manifestation of existence, the next plane of existence. And so we're ready now to look at chapter 4 of that book, which is entitled Sheol and Hades. And we'll say those words a lot this morning. We'll talk a lot about the topics of Sheol and Hades. And so death is that final act by which one departs the world of the living, but it's our final act in this life, but it's the first act, the first thing that we do that leads us into the next plane of existence. So that moment of death is a line of demarcation that separates one existence from the next. And that next existence is one which in the Old Testament is referred to as Sheol, and in the New Testament it's referred to as Hades. So we'll look at kind of how those two are portrayed in both the Old and New Testament. there are many scriptures that link death to both Sheol and to Hades. And so there is those two things are inextricably linked. The next plane of existence is linked to death. And we see that in several scriptures. First, look at Psalm 6, verse 5. And I think I have most of the scriptures for today's lesson actually put up on the board, if not all of them. But it's great to hear the pages turning. But if you don't have a Bible or are not familiar with where to find these verses, then they will be on the board for you to see as well. Psalm 6, verse 5 says, "For there is no mention of you in death. In Sheol, who will give you thanks?" And so David there in that psalm talks about, once we are past this plane of existence, we are done in reference to the things that we can do that would change that plane of existence or that would change where we are. There are not any psalmists in Sheol after death. There's nobody producing more psalms as David is producing psalms in this life, in this plane of existence. So once we get past that point of death, once we are in Sheol, he says, then we can no longer interact with you in the way that we do in this life. And so David there links the idea of death being that entry point into the afterlife. Look also at Proverbs chapter 7, verse 27. Here Solomon is instructing his son, and he is warning him about lady folly or doing things that would pursue and chase after evil things. And he says of this lady folly, he says, her house is the way to Sheol, descending to the chambers of death. And so there again, that link between the afterlife, Sheol, and death as being that entry point in to the next life. And we see that relationship between death and the entry being the entry point into the next life continued on into the New Testament. Acts chapter 2, verse 27. There Peter, on the day of Pentecost, preaching that very first gospel sermon. And as he is preaching, he quotes from the Psalms and he says, "Because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay." And so speaking there of the death of Christ and saying that you will not abandon my soul to Hades, and the idea of decay there being because he had died. And so Jesus had died, but God did not abandon him in death and allow his body to undergo decay, did not leave him in the afterlife where he had gone to. And notice particularly here that this is a direct quotation from Psalm 16, and I think I have that on the next slide. Psalm 16:10 says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay." So when David wrote that original psalm, he used the word Sheol, the Old Testament, the Jewish understanding of the afterlife. And when Peter quotes that verse, he quotes it with in the Greek with the New Testament understanding of the afterlife, which is comparable, which is the same thing to the Old Testament understanding. So Hades and Sheol there, the only two words really that are different in that quotation of that verse, and Peter there using the New Testament language or the New Testament word that means the exact same thing as what David originally wrote. And so we have a connection there between the two thoughts. So it's that gives us the idea then that we can study Sheol and Hades together, and their understanding would be similar or the same for us as it was even thousands of years ago when they were writing the Old Testament. So there again we have Sheol or Hades linked to the idea of death. And then finally in Revelation 1, we see this in John's great vision of Christ there in Revelation chapter 1, beginning verse 17. John says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man, and he placed his right hand on me, saying, 'Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one, and I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. I have the keys of death and of Hades.'" Christ there linking the idea in that vision that John had, linking death to Hades. And so there is a transition from this life, from this plane of existence, from this world of physical existence into the next realm, the next world of spiritual existence. And that transition is death. That is the line of demarcation from this world to the next. And so we see these these worlds of Sheol and Hades inextricably linked to this world by that one act of death. And so that is important for us to understand as we think about what this life is for, is it prepares us for the next life. There is a moment in time coming when we will transition from this life into the next life. And all of this life needs to be in preparation for that moment of transition, for that moment when we go into the next existence. And after that, there is no chance for a redo or for altering where we are at. So let's spend some time this morning looking at Sheol and what it is as it's presented in the New Testament, and understand that as we look at the ideas or what the Bible has to say about Sheol and about Hades, there really aren't many passages that we can turn to that say, let me tell you about Hades, or let me tell you about Sheol, and gives us a list of things that we can understand about those things. Hades and Sheol are mentioned many times in the Bible, but many of the things that we learn or that we know about Sheol or Hades are things that we kind of have to pick up by inference or by just by extrapolation of what the verse is telling us about, the main thought of the verse as it mentions Sheol or Hades, and then we just kind of have to form our ideas from things that we conclude about those verses. So one thing that we can know about Sheol is that it is the realm of the dead. It's a gathering place. It's a place where those who have died gather together. Look at Genesis 35, verse 29. They're describing the death of the patriarch Isaac. It says, Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. This phrase, gathered to his people, is a euphemistic phrase, and it's common, especially in the early books of the Old Testament. It's a common euphemism for death, in that it represents the idea that those who have already died before that person who's died, so before Isaac died, those who died before him were gathered together in a place, and they were awaiting his arrival. They were there already in a place where when Isaac died, he was able to be reunited with them, that he was able to be gathered into their presence. It's painted really as a picture of a reunion, that his ancestors or his people who had died before him were there awaiting him and ready for him to come be with them. So that idea of Sheol then is a gathering place. It's a place of reunion. It's also a place that is located in the depths of the earth. And this is an interesting thought, but Numbers chapter 16, beginning in verse 30, this is the account of when Moses was confronting those who were trying to lead a rebellion against him. They were trying to usurp Moses and Aaron's authority and try to claim the priesthood for themselves and trying to get the people to follow after them, Korah and Dathan's rebellion. And this here is a part of what Moses is saying to them as part of that rebellion. Verse 30 says, "But if the Lord brings about an entirely new thing, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that is theirs, and they descend alive into Sheol, then you will understand that these men have spurned the Lord." Then it came about as he finished speaking these words that the ground that was under them split open, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up and their households and all the men who belonged to Korah and their possessions, so that they and all that belonged to them went down alive to Sheol. And the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. And so often in the Old Testament, when we read about Sheol, or when we think about that realm of the dead, where that next plane of existence is, it's painted as a picture of being someplace deep within the earth. And not that is a literal, actual place where, if we dug down deep enough, or if we were able to take a core sample deep enough into the center of the earth, that somehow we would find a chamber of souls, or that we would find a place where those souls were gathered. But it's just a way of picturing something that really they didn't have a clear understanding or a clear ability to paint a mental picture of where that might be. And so as we think about the grave and placing somebody into a grave, then deeper than that, beneath that, is a place that their soul would descend to as well. Deuteronomy 32, verse 22, adds a little more to that. It says there is, as Moses is saying, he says, "For a fire is kindled in my anger and burns to the lowest part of Sheol and consumes the earth with its yield and sets on fire the foundations of the mountains." And so there the idea of the roots of the mountains, or the foundations of the mountains, being a place that would be at the same depth as the afterlife, or Sheol. And so, again, not necessarily a place that we need to understand as being an actual physical location for where departed souls go, but just a euphemistic place, or a place that paints a description of it being somewhere that is out of our reach, someplace that we can't descend to, or someplace that we cannot go and investigate because it is beyond our ability to get there. And so Sheol stands out of our reach as a place that is in the depths of the earth. Just as it would be hard for us to find the roots of the mountains, so it is also impossible for us to find the depths of Sheol. It is a place that is not attainable by the living. But Sheol is more than just a grave. It's not just a place in the earth. Genesis 25, verse 8, there it says, "When Abraham breathed his last, and he died in a ripe old age, an old man and satisfied with life, and he was gathered to his people." Now think about the life of Abraham. When he was called to follow God, he lived in Ur of the Chaldees. And he left there with his father, and along the journey his father died. And then Abraham came to the land that God had promised to him and his descendants, and he lived there as a nomad. And when Sarah died, she was buried in a place called the Cave of Machpelah. And then when Abraham died, he was buried there as well. And so the idea that this place of Sheol, or this place that Abraham was gathered to, being just a grave, can't be true, because Abraham was not buried where his father was buried. He was not buried where his ancestors were buried. He was buried in a far distant land from where all of them had been buried and died. And yet, when he died, he was gathered to his people. He was taken to the same place that they were taken. And so this realm of the afterlife, this realm of existence for where we abide after our death, is more than just a grave. It's an actual place where the people were assembled after their lives were over. So there is that notion of Sheol presented in the Old Testament as well. We also see this, that there is some relation to judgment. Sheol is not just a neutral place, but there is some aspect of judgment that is related to the idea of the afterlife as well in the Old Testament. Job 21, verse 13 says, "They spend their days in prosperity, and suddenly they go down to Sheol." They spend their days in prosperity, and suddenly they go down to Sheol. This idea of suddenly, some translations may render that as they are shattered by Sheol. And so this carefree life of prosperity that they have lived in this life is broken, is shaken, is destroyed when they enter into the next life. And so there's some aspect of judgment there in that the life that they had lived did not adequately prepare them for the next life. Look also at Job 24, verse 19. It says, "Drought and heat consume the snow waters, so does Sheol to those who have sinned." And so the idea of entering Sheol as a sinner is not a favorable way to enter Sheol. It's not a favorable way to transition through death into the next plane of existence if we have lived our lives as sinners. That's the picture that is painted by Job. Look also at Psalm 9, verse 17. Psalm 9:17 says, "The wicked will return to Sheol, even all the nations who forget God." And so there is a warning that those who forget God, that those who have abandoned his principles will enter into Sheol, and that's not painted as a pretty picture. Both the righteous and the wicked are destined for Sheol, but it is a fearful consideration for the wicked versus the righteous, like Isaac and Abraham and Moses, and those that it says they were gathered to their people, and it's presented as a place of reunion rather than as a place of judgment. But for those who are wicked and sinful, it is presented as a place where judgment is assured. And so there is some aspect of judgment in that afterlife presented for the Old Testament as well. Well, now let's take a few minutes to look at the New Testament location for the afterlife, which is Hades. And the first thing that we want to notice about this is that Hades is not hell. It's an unfortunate translation in some Bibles that they use these two words interchangeably to some degree. I think the Old King James and maybe some older versions or older translations of the New International Version do this as well. But in some locations, we have the word, and I know you guys know as much Greek as I do out there, but the word Hades, there's that first one. That is obviously a different word from the one below it, which is the word that would be transliterated as Gehenna. And that is the word in the New Testament that is translated hell, that is representative of eternal fire, eternal punishment, eternal damnation reserved for the place for those who are wicked after the judgment. But Hades is a different place altogether. Those two words are not used interchangeably in the original language, or not used interchangeably in the New Testament. And it's unfortunate that some translations do that. So what then is Hades? Well, we're going to look at one story in the New Testament. Let's look at Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16 contains for us a passage that we've kind of referred to a few times in this study, but really haven't delved too deeply into yet. Luke 16, beginning in verse 19, says, "Now there was a certain rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, gaily living in splendor every day. And a certain poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, and longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. Besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. Now it came about that the poor man died, and he was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. But now he is being comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between us and you there is a great chasm fixed, in order that those who wish to come over from here to you may not be able, and that none may cross over from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, that you send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them lest they come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. But he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to him, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded if someone rises from the dead. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from this passage about the afterlife. First of all, we're shown that once again, just like with Sheol in the Old Testament, that it is a gathering place. Especially in the sense that Lazarus was carried on angels' wings to a place where he was being comforted in Abraham's bosom. There's that sense that there were those who were there waiting for him, that they were ready to greet him and welcome him into their embrace. And as he is brought into that place, he is gathered to his people. He is gathered into to the place of comfort with people who, like him, lived a righteous life. We see also that it is a real place. There's a lot of discussion about this passage. If you read any commentaries or books, or you do any research online, you're going to find people who have lots of different ideas about whether or not this is a real story. Is this a true story about an actual man named Lazarus and an actual rich man, or is this a parable that Jesus told? Or is it perhaps a retelling of a popular fable or fairy tale of the day? And Jesus is just using that fable or that story that they would have been familiar with to try to drive home a point. And so we need to address that. We need to come to terms with the idea of, is this a real story or not? Well, if it's a parable, then it's the only parable in which Jesus, in all of his teaching, ever names the people that are involved in the story. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, we don't have any names given. In the parables of the sower, we don't have any of them named. And so why would Jesus, in this one instance of telling a parable, decide to give someone a name if he has never done that in any other parable? Is it a fable? Is it a fairy tale from the day that would be used by Jesus just to try to drive home some spiritual point? Again, we don't have evidence of Jesus doing that. We don't have evidence of Jesus taking popular stories or fairy tales of the day and using those to try to paint a picture that would go beyond its original intended meaning. I look at this story and I see it as a story, as an actual series of events that took place. And if not an actual series of events that took place, then certainly told by Jesus as a story that represents actual things that happen. And so if there was no man named Lazarus who was a poor man, if there was no rich man who ignored the needs of Lazarus, then it's representative of a story that could have and maybe has taken place in other times, just one that the players of that story are untold to us or unknown to us. And so I look at this as being an actual story that can tell us the things that Jesus is trying to get across. Now, he is telling this story in reference to the idea of how we live in this life. It's not intended to be a story about the things that take place in the next life, but rather how we live this life. That's what Jesus really wants us to understand. But if the things that Jesus portrays as taking place in the next life are not true, then why would we have any incentive to live the way that he wants us to live in this life? If it doesn't really matter how I treat other people in this life because there is no next life as it's described by Jesus in the story, then why would I live the way he wants me to live in this life? And so, yes, I think it's a true story. And yes, I think the things that are presented as relating to the afterlife or to the next life are absolutely being told by Jesus as true happenings. And so Hades then is a real place. It is a real place, just in the same sense as it is real, as it is true that Jesus wants us to live our lives in a specific way. There are real consequences assigned to whether or not we live in that way. And so this presents for us Hades being a real place. Well, Hades then, as a real place, this story teaches us that it is divided into two sections that are separated by a gulf. We read about torment, the place where the rich man went. And in torment, there are some specific things that are discernible about that location, about that place. And we'll talk about a few of those as we move forward. And then there is another place referred to as paradise. And that is where Lazarus was at as he was taken into Abraham's bosom. And in between those two places, there is a gulf, a chasm fixed, that prohibits the passing back and forth of anyone from one section of Hades into another. And so if you are assigned into paradise, you are not able to descend into the realm of Hades that is labeled as torment. And if you are assigned to that location of torment, you are not able to cross that gulf to get from torment into paradise. There is no going back and forth. Hades here, it is shown to us, is a place of consciousness. Both of these men who have gone on from this life and crossed through death into the next are aware of where they are at. They are conscious. We talked about that some in our last lesson on death, that there's some people that have the idea that there is this soul sleep, or that once you die, you just kind of go into a state of non-existence until the time of judgment, and then you'll be reanimated by God. And that is completely foreign to this story. There is consciousness in the next plane of existence. Both the rich man and Lazarus knew where they were, and they were awake for the things that were going on around them. Another thing that we see about Hades is that our memories will be intact. The rich man knew who Lazarus was. He was able to look across that gulf, and he recognized Lazarus. He knew who he was. He knew that he was being comforted in Abraham's bosom. And so even from a distance, he could know who Abraham was. He had never seen Abraham. How did the rich man know to go to Abraham, or how did Lazarus know to go to Abraham to be comforted? Lazarus had never seen Abraham, and yet both men knew who Abraham was. Their memories were intact. Lazarus understood where he was and how he had gotten there. And the rich man understood what it was about his life that had brought him to this moment, that had brought him to that place. And the rich man remembered his brothers. He knew he had a family still alive in this plane of existence. And he knew that they were living their lives as he had lived his. And he knew that they were destined for where he was at. And so his memories were intact about who he was and how he got there. In Hades, we will also retain our ability to feel emotions. Lazarus, it says, was comforted. Well, if you're being comforted, that must mean that there is some emotional state that is bringing about that need to be comforted. And so Lazarus, as he thought back on his life, as he thought back on the way that he had been treated and the way that he had lived and the way that he had been abused in this life, required that he be comforted by the things that Abraham did for him. His sorrow and his pain had ended, but the rich man was in torment. He felt regret. He felt despair. He knew that it was hopeless for his future, and he felt worry about his brothers who remained. And so his emotional state is easy to discern from the things that he says. And so all of these things are true statements about that next plane of existence, about what comes after this life. It is a real place. It is a place of consciousness. It is a place where our emotions and our feelings are intact. It is a place where we will remember, and we will be able to live either with regret or with hope for the future because of the things that are going on around us. So all of that leads us to one final question for today. Our call to action today is just to ponder this. Is there a more relevant question for us to ask than, where will I go when I die? And as I thought about that, after I had made the outline and submitted it, and it was printed up for you to ponder that question, is there a more relevant question for us to ask than, where will I go when I die? I thought, well, there is one. There's one more relevant question than that. That question is, what can I do now that will impact where I go when I die? See, it's not a random, just happenstance type of scenario where when we die, we have no idea or we have no control over what happens after that moment. This life, this moment right now, is a preparation for that moment. It's a preparation for what comes next. And so while we are definitely consumed or need to be consumed by the question, where will I go when I die? We need to only ask that question if we're willing to answer the next one, which is, what am I willing to do about it now so that I can impact where I go when I die? This morning you have that opportunity to do something that will impact your final destination, that will impact where you go when you die. You can give your life to the Lord. You can put your trust in Him. You can have your sins washed away through baptism. And those will impact where you spend eternity. Those will impact what happens after that moment of death. Or you can ignore it. You can ignore that question. You can say, you know what, I don't know and I don't care, or I'm going to worry about it later. I'm just going to put it off. And that also will impact where you go when you die. This morning, you need to ask that question, and I hope that you have a good response. If you have any need for help in making that decision or understanding what's going to happen, then I hope that you'll seek that help, and I hope that we can help you in some way if you'll come while we stand and sing.